What if I told you that the words Jew, Israelite, and Israel are not the same, and that to confuse them is to miss the deeper pattern of God's covenant for all souls? This is not a matter of dry history, but of the living current that shapes identity and destiny. For in the records of time, I have seen how each name carries a vibration, how each name marks a stage in the unfolding of divine purpose. When I opened the soul records of Abraham, I beheld a man called out from Ur, not for his power or his possessions, but for his willingness to listen to the voice within. He was told, "Your descendants will be as countless as the stars." This was not a promise of flesh only, but of spirit. For from Abraham came Isaac, and from Isaac came Jacob, who would become Israel. In the vision I watched Jacob wrestle with a messenger of God, and in that struggle he was transformed. He was no longer Jacob the deceiver, but Israel. The one who contends with God and prevails. This new name was more than a personal title. It was the seed of a people who would bear the mark of striving with the divine and the 12 sons, born from Jacob, and carried this name into the world. They were not simply brothers, they were the foundation of 12 tribes, the Israelites. And in them, the covenant was planted. Generation by generation, the identity of Israelite meant to be bound to that covenant. It was a sign of belonging to the chosen people, not by accident, but by lineage and by faith. Yet when I trace the current of these names, I see that they are never fixed, for language changes when nations rise and fall. And so does, meaning the name Jew had not yet emerged in the days when all were known as Israelites. It was only later that history carved a distinction, one that would alter the course of faith and culture forever. At the beginning, every tribe of Jacob stood under the name Israelite. From Reuben to Benjamin, they were all tied to the father, whose new name reflected a struggle and a victory. This is the key to understanding. For many who read the sacred texts do not pause to see the layers. They assume Jew and Israelite are interchangeable, but the truth is more precise. Every Israelite was a child of Israel, Jacob. Yet not every Israelite would be called a Jew, for Jew comes from Judah, and Judah was only one among the 12 tribes. As I reflect on this, I sense the weight of misunderstanding that has persisted for centuries, and I see how clarity restores the covenant's depth. Imagine standing among those tribes, each with their banners, each with their inheritance in the land. All are Israelites, yet the seed of distinction already lies waiting. Judah would one day give his name to a people whose devotion to the temple in Jerusalem would define them long after the northern tribes had scattered. Here is the paradox that begins to unfold, and here is why I must tell you that identity is not static. It is living just as your own soul passes through phases from ignorance to awakening. So too did the names of God's people pass through transformation in Jew, Israelite, Israel, each a mirror of a stage in the covenant. I have often said that names are vibrations carrying the record of the soul, and in this matter it is no different. Israelite carries the echo of Jacob's struggle and triumph. Jew carries the echo of Judah's endurance and devotion. Israel as a land carries the echo of promise and prophecy. To confuse them is to blur the sacred design. I urge you to see that even in the beginnings with Abraham and Jacob, the story is already preparing us for divisions, for exiles, for rebirths, for what is hidden in the seed. It will surely rise in the harvest. So when you hear the name Israelite, remember the covenant first given. When you hear the name Jew, remember the lineage of Judah and the faith kept alive through exile. When you hear the name Israel, remember not only a man or a people, but also a land and a destiny tied to the eternal promise. In the records I have read, this is no ordinary story. It is the design of God weaving identity across time, so that each soul who listens may learn that names carry lessons and lessons carry light. Every identity in this story begins with a promise. Abraham called out of Ur, heard a voice that promised descendants as countless as the stars. This covenant flowed through Isaac and reached Jacob. Jacob wrestled with a divine messenger and emerged not merely as a man, but as Israel, one who struggles with God. From him came 12 sons, 12 tribes, the collective called Israelites. This was not only a lineage, but a soul designation, binding a people to God's purpose. At first, every descendant of Jacob was known as an Israelite. and the name Jew had not yet been spoken, but history does not allow identities to remain still for the flow of time. Forces separation, and the meaning of words shifts with the destiny of nations. I have read in the soul records that when the tribes were still united, their covenant was the single bond that defined them. But in the patterns of division, Judah began to carry a mark that would one day set it apart from the rest in those early days. Israelite simply meant a child of Israel and nothing more. It tied each tribe to the moment when Jacob was renamed after wrestling with the angel, yet the seeds of change were already in the soil, for Judah carried a distinct calling, one that would shape the worship centered in Jerusalem and later give rise to the very word Jew. To understand this transformation is to see how spirit reshapes identity across generations. When Solomon's reign ended, the United Kingdom cracked. The northern kingdom kept the name Israel and held 10 tribes with Samaria as its capital. The southern kingdom, known as Judah, held Judah and Benjamin and Jerusalem as its holy center. This was no small political split. It was the cutting of a spiritual fabric. For those in Judah grew more defined by the temple, the priesthood, and the promise tied to the line of David, and in time people began to call them by their land and their tribe Jews from Judah, while their northern brothers, though still Israelites, drifted into shadows that would lead to exile and loss. Here lies the paradox. I must speak to all Jews were Israelites, but not all Israelites became Jews. The distinction is not a minor detail. It is the very clue to understanding how God allows identity to evolve. Judah became the vessel that carried forward temple worship and the teachings of Moses, while the northern tribes were scattered by Assyria and forgotten among nations. Yet Judah endured, and in that endurance, Jew became more than geography. It became faith, culture, survival in my visions. I have seen how the exile of Judah to Babylon refined this identity, for when the temple was burned and the land taken, their devotion did not vanish. Instead, it grew portable synagogues, replaced altars, and the Torah became the living center of the people. The Jew was no longer just a son of Judah. He was one who carried covenant in heart and practice, even in a foreign land. This was the moment when Jew ceased to be a tribal label and became a spiritual. The calling the Israelites as a whole had once been bound by land and lineage, but the Jews of exile were bound by law and worship. And this difference shaped all history to come in the years of return. Under Cyrus, many Jews went back to Jerusalem, but many did not yet. Both those in the land and those scattered abroad kept the same name, the Jew, for it had come to mean not only where you lived, but what faith you kept. This was a new chapter in the covenant, for Israelite spoke of ancestry. Jew spoke of devotion, and both pointed back to the original promise given to Abraham and Jacob. At first, the word Israelite embraced them all. Each tribe carried the mark of Israel's name. But as history unfolded, a separation occurred. Jew was not spoken until Judah, one of the 12 tribes, rose in prominence. Over time, what began as a tribal designation became a religious and cultural identity. Here lies the paradox. All Jews are Israelites, yet not all Israelites are Jews. This shift reveals how language mirrors deeper spiritual transformation identity, moving from geography to inner covenant. When the kingdom divided, the fracture of Israel was not merely political but spiritual, for in the soul records I beheld how the covenant itself seemed to be pulled in 2 directions. The northern kingdom kept the name Israel and contained 10 tribes, while the southern kingdom, Judah, held only Judah and Benjamin. Yet its heart was Jerusalem, where the Temple of Solomon stood. This division around 930. Before Christ was the seed of future exile and identity shift for those in the north, with Samaria as capital drifted quickly into alliances with foreign gods. They worshipped on high places and mixed the covenant with practices of surrounding nations. But Judah, though smaller, held the promise of David's line and the temple, which kept the rhythm of sacrifice and law alive. The split set the stage for a truth that has echoed through centuries. All Jews are Israelites, but not all Israelites are Jews. For when the Assyrians invaded in 722 before Christ, the northern kingdom fell. The 10 tribes were scattered among nations, their names dissolved into foreign lands, and they became what history calls the lost tribes of Israel, their voices faint, their lineage hidden in other peoples, their covenant memory fading like smoke carried by the wind. In contrast, Judah endured, though weakened and besieged. They clung to Jerusalem and their temple. They called themselves by their land, by their tribe, and the word Jew began to take firm shape as a mark of survival and devotion. Yet even Judah would not stand forever, for in 586 before Christ, Babylon came under Nebuchadnezzar, and the holy city was burned, the temple reduced to ash, the people carried into exile. This could have been the end, but instead it became the turning point, for when the Israelites of the north had vanished into nations, the Jews of Judah did not lose themselves in Babylon. They adapted, they preserved, they transformed in visions. I have seen their gatherings in exile where no temple stood, yet scrolls were unrolled and voices recited, the law of Moses where sacrifices were gone. But the Sabbath became a lifeline where altars were no more. Yet prayer rose from every home here the Jew was forged, not only as a man of Judah, but as one bound by Torah, by covenant, by devotion. Portable and unbroken, what had been tribal now became spiritual. What had been geographic now became universal. The exile created a people who could survive without land, without king, without temple, because their identity was written within. This is why I tell you that the destruction of Jerusalem, though tragic, was also the birth of resilience. For the Jew of Babylon was no longer merely an Israelite by blood. He was a covenant keeper by choice and by practice. The law was etched into daily life. The synagogue became the new sanctuary, and the rabbi emerged as a guide of wisdom and memory. Thus Jew became a name not of weakness but of strength. While the northern Israelites faded into forgotten tribes, Judah preserved the flame and passed it forward through centuries. So understand that the division of kingdoms and the exiles that followed were not accidents. They were stages in the refining fire of identity. Israelite was the name of origin. Jew became the name of endurance. And Israel, as a land, became the name of promise, waiting for restoration in this way. The covenant was never lost. It was transformed, carried in a new form, just as the soul, when stripped of its outer garments, finds its true essence. So too the people of Judah in exile found that God was not bound to a temple of stone, but lived wherever his law was honored and his name remembered. After Solomon's reign, the house of Israel broke apart. The northern kingdom, still called Israel, held 10 tribes with Samaria as its capital. The southern kingdom, Judah, contained the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, with Jerusalem at its heart. This split changed everything. Those of Judah became increasingly distinct. Their worship centered on the temple, their loyalty tied to David's line. The name Jew emerged here, marking those of Judah's territory and faith. Meanwhile, the northern tribes walked a path toward disappearance. The exile in Babylon stripped Judah of its land and its temple, yet it could not strip them of covenant. For when the walls of Jerusalem fell and the sacred fire of sacrifice was extinguished, the people carried the law into their hearts. And from that moment, Jew no longer meant only the descendant of Judah, but one who lived the covenant wherever he dwelled. The synagogue was born out of necessity, not as rival to the temple, but as its echo, portable and enduring. The rabbis rose, not as kings or priests, but as teachers and interpreters, guiding the people to remember that God was not bound by geography, but present in obedience and faith. Here in the crucible of exile, the Jew was forged into a vessel of survival, for when outward forms are broken, inward essence is revealed. 70 years passed, and under the decree of Cyrus the Great, the Jews were allowed to return to their homeland. Some journeyed back to rebuild Jerusalem and raise the Second Temple. Others remained, scattered across Persia, Babylon, and beyond yet. Wherever they lived, they carried the same name, Jew, and with it the same devotion. This is the turning point where identity shifts from bloodline to spiritual practice. Israelite had once marked descent from Jacob, Jew, now marked one who remained faithful to the covenant, the Sabbath, the Torah, the traditions that distinguished them from the nations around them. Exile taught that God's presence could not be destroyed by burning stone or conquered by foreign armies, but would live wherever his people remembered him and kept his law. This resilience became the secret of survival and the secret of expansion for the Jew, in Babylon or Susa or Nineveh, could remain fully himself without land, without king, without priesthood. This was the genius of faith turned inward. It made the covenant indestructible. Many returned and laid new stones on Mount Zion, but many more stayed and planted synagogues and communities across distant lands. This scattering did not weaken. Their name it strengthened it for Jew, came to mean not just a man of Judah, but a keeper of God's covenant, no matter the nation around him. And so Jewish identity transcended boundaries. What was once tied to the soil of Canaan was now tied to the soul of the people themselves. This transformation has meaning for every soul who asks, "Who am I?" For identity is not only inheritance, but choice. Not only where you were born, but what law you live by. The Jews carried this truth in their flesh and memory. Even as they endured persecution and displacement, the covenant lived on within them, while the 10 tribes were lost among foreign tongues. Judah preserved the flame and carried it into ages. Yet unborn from this foundation, Rabbinic Judaism emerged a faith centered on scripture, study, prayer, and moral practice, not on tribal lineage, but on covenantal fidelity. And this made Jew a word of spiritual weight in later centuries. The prophets spoke of restoration not only of land, but of identity. Ezekiel's vision of dry bones rising was not merely about a nation, but about the endurance of a people who seemed dead, yet lived again. For though Babylon had sought to erase them, they became more defined than ever. Jew meant a people who could be crushed, yet not consumed, scattered, yet not erased, humbled, yet not forgotten. Their survival was a prophecy of God's faithfulness for every generation, and in this survival there is a mirror for your own soul. You too may lose outward security, you too may be stripped of forms and titles, yet what endures is what is written within. So the story of exile and return is not only history. In 722 BC, Assyria swept through the northern kingdom. The 10 tribes were scattered and became the lost tribes of Israel. Their voices faded into other nations, their names preserved only in prophecy. But Judah endured longer. In 586 BC, Babylon destroyed Jerusalem and carried Judah away. Yet exile did not erase them. Stripped of land and temple, the Jews found God within scrolls and gatherings. Synagogues replaced altars, and Torah study replaced sacrifice. In captivity, identity moved from soil to spirit. This resilience would define Judaism forever. When the decree of Cyrus opened the gates for return, many Jews made their way back to Jerusalem and began to rebuild the temple. Yet not all returned, for some had planted roots in Babylon and Persia, and their children knew foreign streets. As home still, the covenant bound them together, and whether in Jerusalem or in exile, they carried the same name, Jew. This moment revealed that identity was no longer a matter of soil alone, it was a matter of spirit. The second temple rose upon Mount Zion, but the true sanctuary was already etched in the hearts of the people. Those who returned placed stone upon stone, yet those who stayed abroad placed law upon life. And both paths were woven into the same covenant. This duality gave rise to a stronger faith, the Jew of Jerusalem who offered sacrifice, and the Jew of Babylon who gathered in synagogue, both kept alive the promise of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is how identity widened beyond tribe. For in the soul records I see that lineage was no longer enough. What mattered was fidelity to the covenant practices that preserved distinction. Sabbath worship, dietary laws, circumcision, devotion to Torah, study, these became the marks of belonging more powerful than borders or kings, for the exile had taught that even when the land is lost, the covenant remains portable and eternal. When the temple stood again, the people rejoiced, yet their memory of exile shaped them into a people who would never again rely solely on buildings or rulers. They had learned to survive as a community of law and faith. They had become resilient, portable, and enduring from this soil. Rabbinic Judaism emerged, teachers and interpreters guiding the people in daily obedience. The rabbi took the role once filled by prophet and priest, reminding them that God's dwelling was with those who remembered his word, not only those who stood in his house. This transition made Jew a term that carried both ancestry and spirit, both heritage and practice, the return to Jerusalem deepened devotion, yet the scattering across nations spread influence. Communities formed across Persia, Egypt, and beyond, and everywhere they went, they brought with them a portable identity that could not be erased. Here lies the secret of survival. Identity no longer depended on temple walls. It depended on faith lived daily. The Jew had become a covenant keeper whose faith could travel with him across seas and generations. This was not a weakening, it was a strengthening. For while the 10 tribes of the north were dissolved into history, Judah carried the covenant in a form that could not be lost. This is why the Jew remained. When others vanished, their very survival was prophecy fulfilled. God's covenant cannot be erased, only transformed and sustained by those who keep it. Exile had shifted the center from geography to spirit, and the return sealed this truth. Even as the temple rose again, the true sanctuary remained within the people themselves. This truth speaks to every soul, for your identity is not only what place you come from, it is what covenant you honor, what law you keep, what truth you carry, even when outward structures fall. The Jew of that age became the witness that God's promise is stronger than empire, stronger than exile, stronger than fire. 70 years later, under Persia, some Jews returned to Jerusalem and rebuilt the temple. Others remained abroad, carrying their faith across empires. Out of this period emerged rabbinic leadership, Torah-centered devotion, and customs that bound them together: Sabbath, circumcision, dietary laws. Jew now meant more than bloodline. It signified fidelity to God's covenant, portable and indestructible. The exile forged a people who could survive without borders, yet remain anchored in faith. In this we glimpse the universal truth. When outward forms collapse, inner spirit holds the covenant alive. The scattering of the Jews after the return from Babylon did not weaken their covenant, it expanded it, for communities arose in every land where they were planted, and the synagogue became the living center of worship, study, and memory. This made the Jew not only a son of Judah, but a bearer of Torah and covenant wherever he walked in Persia, Egypt, or Greece. Identity no longer required a temple of stone, it required faith enacted in daily life. This is why Jew became a name, stronger than exile, a word that marked a people who could survive any empire. For they had learned that God is not confined to geography, but lives within obedience and remembrance. As centuries turned, rabbinic teachers shaped a new rhythm of devotion, guiding the people in prayer, law, and practice, and this shift prepared them for ages when the temple itself would again be lost for. In 70 after Christ, when Rome destroyed the second temple, the Jew did not vanish. Instead, the same covenant that sustained them in Babylon sustained them once more, their faith portable, their identity unbroken. Jew had now come to mean not only bloodline but resilience, a people whose survival itself was prophecy. The exile and scattering created a new reality, for identity once tied to 12 tribes was now tied to the endurance of a remnant. Judah, Benjamin, and Levi became the carriers of covenant, and their faithfulness kept alive the name of Israel, even when the 10 northern tribes had disappeared into the mist of history. I must tell you that in the records of time, I see this transformation as both judgment and blessing. Judgment, because disobedience led to exile; blessing, because exile forged resilience. The Jew became not only an heir of Judah, but a witness of God's faithfulness, proof that covenant once spoken cannot be erased by conquest. Their customs, Sabbath, circumcision, dietary law, festivals became visible marks that set them apart from nations around them, and these marks preserved them through centuries of dispersion. When the land was lost, their identity was not. When kingdoms shifted, their covenant endured. This is why I say that the Jew became the keeper of promise, not bound to soil, but bound to spirit. And this distinction matters deeply for Israelite once. Marked ancestry, Jew, marked a covenant, lived with devotion, and Israel as a word came to hold a double meaning, both the ancient nation and the eternal promise. Yet another shift was waiting for in modern times. The state of Israel was reborn in 1948 after centuries of wandering oppression and persecution. A homeland was declared, yet this new reality introduced a new layer. Israeli now meant a citizen of that land. Jew still meant a covenantal identity tied to faith, heritage, and law. And not all Israelis were Jews, for the land was also home to Arabs, Christians, Druze, and others. Here lies the complexity. Jew and Israeli overlap, yet remain distinct. Jew is covenantal. Israeli is political. Both are real, both are meaningful. But one speaks to divine promise, while the other speaks to national identity. Centuries later, in 1948, Israel became a modern state. Yet the word Israeli introduced a new layer. An Israeli is a citizen of the state, whether Jew, Muslim, Christian, or Druze. A Jew, however, carries the covenantal identity that traces back to Abraham and Judah. Thus, Jew and Israeli overlap but are not identical. To be Jewish is to belong to a covenantal people. To be Israeli is to belong to a political nation. Both matter, but one speaks to destiny while the other to citizenship. Prophecy declared that Israel would not vanish, and history has confirmed it. For though the tribes were scattered and kingdoms destroyed, the covenant thread endured unbroken, and Jew became the living sign of God's promise across time. Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel spoke not only to their own age, but to generations unborn. They saw a day when dry bones would rise, when Judah and Israel would be reunited, when a shepherd king would gather the scattered and restore them as one people in the readings of the soul records. I have seen how these visions were not mere poetry, but living currents shaping destiny. Exile did not cancel the covenant, it refined it. Judgment did not erase the people, it purified them. The Jew became the evidence that prophecy breathes through history. The very survival of this people after Assyria, Babylon, Rome, and centuries of dispersion is itself a miracle and a sign of God's faithfulness, for no empire could extinguish what God had chosen. Israel is more than a nation. It is a covenantal symbol. And Jew is more than a tribal name. It is the witness of endurance. Prophecy also revealed that through Israel blessing would come to all nations. When Abraham was told in you, all families of the earth will be blessed, it was a promise that his seed would carry a light not only for themselves, but for the world. This light reached its fulfillment in the coming of Messiah, through whom Jew and Gentile alike could enter a new covenant. Yet even in this fulfillment, the distinct calling of Israel was not erased. Paul spoke of Gentiles being grafted into the olive tree, of Israel sharing in its root and promise, but he also declared that God has not cast away his people. Israel remains central to the divine. The plan, their restoration, is part of the redemption of the world. This mystery shows that identity is layered. Jew carries the heritage of Judah. Israelite carries the lineage of Jacob. Israel carries the destiny of God's chosen nation. Together they form a tapestry of past, present, and future. When I look upon the soul patterns of this people, I see both suffering and resilience, persecution, dispersion, and return, exile, and hope. And through it all, the covenant thread shining with constancy. Prophecy is not merely prediction. It is the echo of eternal law, that what God has spoken cannot be overturned. The existence of Jews today, after centuries of dispersion, is testimony that covenant is living. The re-establishment of Israel as a nation is testimony that prophecy unfolds in history. These two together declare that the story is not yet finished, and that restoration in its fullest sense is still to come. I must tell you that these truths carry lessons for every soul, for just as Israel's name was changed from Jacob after struggle, so too your identity can be transformed after trial. Just as exile stripped them of land and temple, yet revealed the essence of faith, so too your losses can reveal what endures. Just as prophecy carried them through centuries, so too you are carried by promises planted deep in your own soul. Jew, Israelite, Israel. These names are not distant labels. They are mirrors of the journey every soul makes, from inheritance to struggle, from loss to resilience, from promise to fulfillment. And in their survival, you may see your own path confirmed. Throughout Scripture, Israel is the vessel of divine promise. From Abraham's call to the prophet's visions, God declared that Israel would be restored, that scattered tribes would be gathered, that Messiah would unite Jew and Gentile alike. Paul later spoke of Gentiles grafted into Israel's olive tree, showing that the covenant's reach was never meant to stop at borders. The lesson is clear. Israel's story is humanity's story. Jew, Israelite, and Israel are not mere labels, but signs of God's enduring covenant. In them we see both history and prophecy, exile and return, struggle and promise. To study these names is to see the pattern of God's faithfulness and to recognize that the same hand guiding Abraham still guides every soul who seeks. Names change, kingdoms fall, tribes are scattered, yet the covenant remains. And this is the truth I must leave with you. For when I trace the current of Jew, Israelite, and Israel through the records of time, I do not see only history, I see the time, the hand of God, shaping identity so that no empire, no exile, no destruction can erase what he has planted. Abraham was called from Ur, and the promise given to him has not failed. Jacob was renamed Israel after struggle, and that struggle still defines the people who bear his name. Judah endured when 10 tribes were lost, and from Judah came the name Jew, which now carries not only bloodline, but faith, resilience, and devotion. Israel as land, as people, and as promise, has endured through ages of conquest and scattering, and in its rebirth as a nation, the ancient covenant still breathes alive. The lesson that emerges is simple yet profound. Identity is not merely what you inherit, it is what you embody. The Israelites inherited Jacob's name, but many were lost. The Jews embodied covenant through exile, and so they survive. The modern Israeli holds a passport, but only the one who carries faith carries the eternal covenant. The soul, too, follows this pattern, for you inherit a body and a name, but only what you live by faith will endure when all else is stripped away. I tell you that this story is your story, for you have been scattered within yourself, divided between outer and inner, between the pull of nations and the whisper of covenant you have. Known exile when faith seems far, you have known return when the law is remembered in the heart, you have known the temple's fall when outer security crumbled, and you have known the portable sanctuary when prayer kept you alive. In the night the Jew, the Israelite, the land of Israel, are symbols of the journey. Every soul walks to discover that what God ordains cannot be broken. I have often said that the records of souls are not for curiosity, but for confirmation. They show that God is faithful, and that every struggle, every exile, every loss can become the very means by which resilience and truth are born. Israel's divisions show us the cost of disobedience, yet their survival shows us the mercy of God. Judah's exile shows us the pain of judgment, yet the return shows us the constancy of promise. The scattering of Jews across nations shows us the fragility of flesh, yet their endurance shows us the indestructibility of spirit. This is why their story is not finished, for prophecy declares restoration and reunion. And in that final vision, God's covenant is not only with Israel, but with all nations through Messiah. The blessing has spread, yet the root remains holy, and the tree still stands, grafted with branches, both wild and natural, carrying one life. Through many forms, the echo for your own life is clear. When you are divided within, you may feel like the northern tribes lost to memory, yet if you preserve the covenant of the heart like Judah, you will endure when you are stripped of outer forms. You may feel like Jerusalem in ashes. Yet if you turn to the law written within, you will find the sanctuary still alive. When you wander across foreign lands of thought and trial, you may feel dispersed. Yet if you carry faith daily, you will remain whole. Jew, Israelite, Israel, these names remind us that identity is more than label.